It was a muggy Tuesday morning in August, the kind of morning where the air sticks to your skin and makes every breath feel heavier than it should. Richard Nelson pulled his old sedan into the lot of the Blue Ridge Police Department. The building didn't look like much, just another brick structure tucked in the rolling hills of North Carolina. But to Richard, it was about to become the center of his world. He stepped out of the car wearing a plaid shirt that had seen better days, jeans that were more worn than pressed, and sneakers scuffed from years of use. He didn't look like a man who had spent 20 years climbing the ranks in law enforcement, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Richard Nelson was the new chief of police, but today he wasn't walking into that precinct with the shiny title of chief. He wanted to see the department the way it really was, without the staged greetings or forced handshakes that usually greeted someone in his position. As a black man stepping into leadership in a department that carried a long shadow of misconduct and bad reputation, Richard knew that the polished surface never told the truth. If he was going to lead, he had to see the rot beneath the paint. He adjusted the brim of his baseball cap and looked across the parking lot, watching the officers moving in and out. Their conversations were casual, their laughter carried in the air, and a few of them glanced at him, but no one seemed to recognize who he was. That was fine. His appointment had only been announced days ago, and he had deliberately avoided any publicity about when he would arrive. This was his chance to walk in unnoticed, to see the department in its raw form. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he had come here to do. Rooting out the toxicity of an entire police culture wasn't going to be easy, and he knew he'd face resistance every step of the way. But Richard had never been one to shy away from a hard fight. The side entrance door gave way with a creak, and Richard slipped inside, blending in with the background noise of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and casual chatter. The fluorescent lights glared down on the tiled floors, which smelled faintly of bleach mixed with the ever-present staleness of old coffee. Richard slowed his pace, his eyes darting from group to group. Some officers were hunched over paperwork. Others leaned against desks swapping stories, their laughter rising above the noise. For a few moments, no one paid him any attention. Then a voice cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. "Hey, you." Richard turned. A white officer was striding toward him, his grin smug, his eyes narrowed with amusement. The badge on his chest read Daniels. Behind him, a handful of other officers leaned against the wall, clearly interested in what was about to happen. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but Daniels didn't give him the chance. "Lost, are we? This isn't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." His words were laced with condescension, each syllable meant to belittle. Richard froze. He wasn't sure whether to correct the man right then and there or let the scene play out. Before he could decide, Daniels stepped closer, his tone rising for his audience. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." The officers behind him laughed, one slapping a hand against the table as if this were the funniest show he'd seen all week. Richard clenched his jaw. His heart was pounding, but he kept his expression calm. And then, without warning, Daniels leaned in close and spat in his face. Time seemed to stop. Richard felt the warm spit slide down his cheek. The laughter around him grew louder, filling the air with cruel amusement. One officer muttered something about riffraff knowing their place. Richard's pulse hammered in his ears, but he forced himself to remain composed. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his face. His voice was calm but sharp when he finally spoke. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniel smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong here." More laughter erupted. Richard said nothing. Instead, he turned and walked away, his pace steady, his shoulders squared. Moments later, the intercom crackled to life, calling all personnel to the briefing room. Richard's time undercover was over. The briefing room was filled with chatter and laughter as officers filed in with coffee mugs and inside jokes. Richard entered quietly through a side door, now carrying a folder with the precinct's seal. He stood at the edge of the room watching the faces, some familiar from just minutes before. Daniels leaned casually against the wall, his arms crossed, still wearing that smug expression. At the front, Captain Harris called the room to order. "All right, settle down. We've got an important introduction today." The chatter died down. Harris cleared his throat. "As you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to introduce our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department. Richard stepped forward. His footsteps echoed in the silence. The room froze as recognition spread. The smirk on Daniel's face faltered, the color draining from his skin. The laughter that had filled the halls earlier was gone, replaced by stunned silence. Richard placed the folder on the lectern and looked across the room. "Good morning. My name is Richard Nelson, and as of today I am your new chief of police." The words hung in the air. No one moved. Daniels's face flushed deep red, his earlier bravado crumbling. Richard held his gaze a moment longer before letting his eyes sweep the room. His voice carried calm authority. "When I arrived this morning, I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. What I witnessed was eye-opening. In my short time here, I've already seen behavior that is not just unprofessional, but unacceptable. And let me make one thing clear. The culture that has been allowed to fester here ends today." The room shifted uneasily. Officers exchanged nervous glances. Richard's tone sharpened. "Respect is not optional. Without it, we fail not only each other but the community we serve. This morning some of you laughed while what you thought was a powerless man was put in his place. But hear me clearly. Everyone who walks through these doors deserves respect whether they wear a badge or not." His words sliced through the silence. No one dared to move. Daniel shifted, sweat forming on his brow. Richard wasn't finished. He stepped closer to the podium's edge, his gaze sweeping over the group. "Change is difficult, but there will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual. Officer Daniels." He turned his focus on the man by the wall, whose confidence had evaporated. "When you spat in my face, you didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected the badge, the oath, and the community we swore to protect." Daniel stammered. "Chief, I didn't know." Richard cut him off. "That's the problem. You didn't care to know. You assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that assumption is why this department has lost the trust of the people it serves." The silence was heavy. Every officer stood frozen. Richard turned back to the room. "What I witnessed wasn't just one man's mistake, it was a culture. A culture where prejudice is tolerated, where cruelty is laughed at. And that stops now. I have spent my career fighting for justice, not just in the streets but within the walls of departments like this one. Change won't be easy. It won't happen overnight. But as long as I'm chief, this department will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." He gave a slight nod to Captain Harris. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending investigation. And for those of you thinking this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is the first of many changes." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's face burned with shame. Richard stood tall. "This isn't about punishment. It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to it, then this isn't the place for you. But if you are ready to do better, to be better, then we will move forward together. Know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way." The meeting ended in silence. Officers filed out, no longer laughing. Daniel stormed off, avoiding every stare. Back in his office, Richard sat down at his desk, exhaling deeply. He knew this was only the beginning. Years of bad habits and broken trust wouldn't vanish overnight. But he hadn't come to Blue Ridge to make friends. He had come to make change. Over the following weeks, whispers filled the halls. Officers who once laughed with Daniels now avoided him. Recruits watched more carefully. Some of the younger officers approached Richard quietly, admitting they had been complicit out of fear. "I want to do better," Chief one said. Richard replied firmly, "That's all I ask. It starts with you." Not everyone wanted to change. Daniels appealed his suspension, claiming unfair treatment. But Richard held firm. An internal review revealed years of complaints, excessive force, inappropriate comments, all brushed aside until now. His appeal was denied. The message was clear. The old way was gone. Conversations about bias, accountability, and community trust sparked mixed reactions. Some resisted, others listened. Richard kept walking the halls, his presence a reminder of what leadership looked like. Slowly, the culture shifted. A recruit found the courage to speak up. An officer rethought his approach on a call. Each step was small, but each one mattered. At a community event, a young boy approached him shyly. "Are you really the chief?" he asked. Richard crouched to meet his eyes. I am. The boy hesitated, then whispered, My dad says the police don't care about us. Richard's voice was gentle. I can't change the past, but I promise we're working to do better. And if you ever need help, you come find me, okay? The boy nodded, a small smile on his face. Moments like that reminded Richard why he had taken this job. By the end of his first year, the precinct wasn't perfect, but it was different. Officers unwilling to adapt were gone, replaced with those who shared his vision. The community, once skeptical, began to notice change, small, fragile signs of trust being rebuilt. One evening, Richard stood in the main hallway as officers clocked out. The laughter sounded different now, lighter, genuine, not cruel. For the first time, Richard felt a quiet sense of hope. Change was never easy, but it was always worth the fight.